Hey everybody, Rich Straffolino here with Gestalt IT, and we're here for another Gestalt IT rundown. That's right, this is where we run down the IT news of the week. We're talking news, we're talking trends, and we do it live on the Ewing tubes every single week. I am joined not by my usual co-host, Tom Hollingsworth. No, he's off at Networking Field Day. Today, we're privileged and lucky to have the CTO advisor himself, Keith Townsend. Keith, thanks so much for being on.
Thanks for having me, Rich.
So let's jump right into it. Today we had some big news, especially big with considering the Tech Field Day connection. We had the news that Skyport Systems was acquired by Cisco. They had recently presented, I believe it was at Tech Field Day in November. And if you're not familiar with them, they were all about. They had the weirdest slide deck I ever remember, but their big thing was security. Like they were, maybe it was Storage Field Day. Anyway, their big thing was security. It's completely securing on a server side, like literally from the point at which any kind of hardware leaves their facility all the way to getting to you and then hitting up the software end. It was just like security, security, security. And their whole pitch was, listen, we know everything's going to go to the cloud. Yes, we're in a super niche market, but there are some things you can't move to the cloud, and those things really need to be secure. So we're doing like this ground up security methodology. And I really enjoyed their presentation because it was super depressing from a security perspective. But with the news coming out that they're getting acquired by Cisco, they're going to be split, actually, interestingly enough, between the data center computing systems group and the service provider group in the networking division. So Keith, I'm just kind of curious, what are your thoughts? You saw their presentation, you were there.
Yeah, I was there. You know, they actually presented at two, they had a pivot. They presented at two Tech Field Day events. They presented at a Network Field Day and at a Tech Field Day. So the fact that they're getting split off into two groups into Cisco kind of makes sense because their messaging was never really clear. But they, from like, what is this product? Who do I sell into? Do I sell into the application team so you can secure your applications? Like, hey, run ultra secure SAP. Do I sell into the security team and say, hey, Active Directory is secure? Is this a networking appliance? And you do SDN solutions on top, which, you know, it was, I think, one of their initial plays to say, hey, you can do NFV devices on this infrastructure. So the fact that they're split off into Cisco, I would imagine that they'll have NFV plays within Cisco as well as traditional HCI, which Cisco already has HCI. So, you know, I'm not surprised Cisco would buy them because Cisco kind of buys anything and everybody. But the best of luck to those guys. Hopefully they get the funding. That, you know, they were kind of a go at security alone. This is one of the things we challenge them on. Like, hey, this is a really big thing that you're trying to solve. And you're such a small company. You kind of need an ecosystem. So maybe Cisco can help provide some of that ecosystem.
Yeah, Cisco likes to add redundancy to all their acquisitions, right? So, you know, they have a couple SD-WAN SKUs. Now they're going to have a couple HCI plays. You know, they got to play the field. That's the Cisco way. So I wanted to get into some broader topics here. I thought one that was interesting, and again, one that generated quite a bit of discussion. It was really fascinating. There was an op-ed in the Financial Times by VC Michael Moritz, kind of advocating for an adoption of more of a Chinese technology work ethic in Silicon Valley. He specifically cited the fact that people are working 80-hour plus work weeks, using minimal vacation time, frugal accommodations, taking, you know, economy travels, not really having the trappings of the typical Silicon Valley, you know, ping pong table in the conference room, that kind of stuff, and overall just kind of putting aside personal time and really focusing on a company even beyond an initial startup period, and allowing that to really make them pivot and be hyper competitive in the West, something we haven't seen a ton of Chinese tech companies really been successful at. Me and Tom have talked about this for a number of times, the challenges for both Western and for Chinese companies kind of to cross markets between the two. I'm just kind of curious, Keith, from your perspective, in IT, there is this conversation going on constantly about automation, about trying to do more with less, about not necessarily having, you know, to put in the man hours on an IT side, you know, to manually configure and do things, you know, kind of the old fashioned way is, I mean, everything is automate. is a little tone deaf to focus on just purely on a man-hour perspective instead of maybe, to use maybe a buzzword or buzz phrase, working smarter. I'm just kind of curious on your perspective.
Well, it's interesting that a VC would come out with a post. I guess in this scenario, you always ask the question, follow the money. Who has the most benefit out of increased productivity per worker? If I was to work 80 hours a week for basically the same pay or output, and I end up reducing labor costs for my investors and company management, I don't benefit from that. The VC, this is kind of a self-serving post. He directly benefits, and I may have made that same 80 hours that I put in. I'm taking the same amount of risk. I don't guarantee a better exit for a startup or beyond, and I lose, and I'll end up getting a divorce, and my kids have, turn out to be horrible people. So, what I think is, I'm going to channel some Greg Farrell on this and say this is probably a pretty idiotic post.
Yeah, I mean, I guess he's a VC. He really doesn't care if people like him or not. He has bags and bags of cash, so he's always going to be popular. But I will say at least it spurred a conversation, whether it started from an inane premise or not. I also take exception a little bit just on a cultural perspective of kind of lumping. I mean, you can barely lump together you can't really lump together U.S. culture, working on the West Coast versus working on the East Coast and anywhere in between is vastly different. And, China has even more cultural division. So it gets problematic for me just to say this is how everyone in China works, because that's patently false. But I did just think it was an interesting conversation that came out of it, at least if it wasn't.
Yeah, we could probably do a whole podcast on this topic. And, just the simple fact that you can't run somebody, you can't sprint forever. That's just a fact. The human body has limits. I can try to spend 80 hours a week at work. I can physically be in my seat, but I won't be any more productive than the 40. I may even be less productive than when I'm working 40 to 50 hours a week. So, there's a VC who isn't trained in this area of expertise. This is not, we like experts here in the US and in technology. He's not a expert in productivity. So, what, I didn't even bother to read the post. It sounds like a waste of my time, frankly.
All right. Well, hopefully something a little better use of your time is getting into the ins and outs of is it GDPR? GDPR. Yes. Okay. Geez, it's so, come up with better acronyms, Europe. Anyway, it's the big European privacy law. It was originally came out, I believe, in 2016, and we're now just starting to see it needing to come into effect. And we're seeing really big, everyone has to deal with it. Basically, if you're over 250 people in your organization, you're storing any kind of consumer data, you have to take major steps to make sure you're in compliance with this. And we're seeing big companies like Facebook now coming out. We had Sheryl Sandberg announcing big changes to their privacy policy. They're going to be putting in a global privacy center. This isn't really all that unusual. Every 2 or 3 years, it seems like Facebook comes out with a revamped privacy center that's supposed to allay all your concerns that you have no idea where any of your data is. But ostensibly, this will put all your data in one place, provide a perhaps we'll say single pane of glass to view all your privacy. But just for some context, the reason companies are doing this is because there are very stiff penalties per violation. They can face fines up to 4% of global annual turnover per violation, which could get insanely expensive, insanely fast. Obviously, we're seeing, Facebook, to their credit, has for a long time at least provided for data export, which is one of the rules in GDPR. Geez, oh Louise, I'm never going to be able to say that right. But Keith, I'm interested from your perspective. I see a lot of sky is falling posts. I see a lot of we're still completely unprepared. How are businesses going to react when this regulation goes live and we really start seeing the teeth of it?
I think a lot of organizations are going to be in trouble. We've talked about this at almost every event that I've been to. We Tech Field Day did a Convolt Go, went to Convolt Go. We did a couple of podcasts with the Convolt Go folks. sponsors of the CTO Advisor. We've had sponsored podcasts on GDPR. It is a tough thing. Beyond just Facebook, let's just say that let's say that all data is ephemeral, and Facebook could magically say, you know what, I have the right to be forgotten, forget me in Facebook, and Facebook never backed it up. It never had distributed data centers. It never let other applications export your data, and you could solve these problems magically by having ephemeral data. But we don't have ephemeral data. I think our good friends, or at least my good friends over at Pencil Data, are trying to figure this out, how to use like blockchain and these technologies to say that, okay, if I have data on secondary media like tape, God forbid, or hard disk. How do I say Keith Townsend no longer wants his information in my database? Erase anything that's identifiable with Keith Townsend, including, you know, purchase histories, whatever the case that I can legally ask for. It is an immensely difficult challenge. And we still have companies that have yet to virtualize their infrastructures. So for companies that are on that other end of the spectrum that fall under purview of GDPR, if you haven't even virtualized yet, and you're still backing up to tape and you're sending this stuff off to Iron Mountain, how can you prove to me that you've deleted the data, my personally identifiable data, from all of your inventory? So what Facebook is doing is a good thing. They seem like they have the architecture, the infrastructure, and the general capability to follow GDPR. I think it's everybody else, the non-web scalers, that are surprisingly going to get caught up in this and have serious problems.
Well, and I think that's also why, you know, you brought up Commvault, and I'm also thinking of NetApp. I'm thinking of basically anybody that's historically kind of been in like an old backup and recovery, old storage, is now all of a sudden they're all being branded as data management companies. Like that was the big thing I just remember with Commvault this year, is all they wanted to talk about was how they're a data management company, and makes complete sense when now all of a sudden that has like a visceral financial implication if you cannot manage it properly.
Yeah, and then we're generally focused in infrastructure with our audience in this podcast and kind of my audience in general. But this is not an infrastructure challenge only. This is an application challenge. You know, if you have a legacy SAP Oracle based application that you need to remove users' data from that application, this is first the application level challenge. How do I go into the application, remove that data, and not break all of my reporting, all of my business reporting, et cetera? How do I not make this data anonymous and still have the same level of business value that the application has always had, and from a basic perspective, not break the application?
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how organizations react and how often they're going to we're going to see these fines kind of rolled out. In terms of companies, Facebook obviously spans the globe, well over a billion users now. For companies that maybe don't have as big of a footprint in the US, primarily European facing companies, are we going to see, kind of as a consumer, are consumers going to see the benefits of, kind of GDPR visibility, data accountability in the US, or is that only going to be for the big, like for Google, Facebook?
I think we're going to see the benefits across the board. And I think we focus on kind of the fines and the difficult, the medicine part of GDPR, but a lot of businesses are actually going to see advantages to this, inherent to the capability of being able to extract and delete data from systems. Becomes this whole new level of visibility within data systems. So you're not going to say, oh, I'm going to focus on, I have 1,000 customers in the US and 200 customers in Europe, so I'm not going to normalize the data set for customers across my data set. I will, because now that I've added this new data layer of filtering and capability, I I now, as a result, have better business reporting. I can have now a data driven business. So there's a lot of advantages to it, and I don't think companies are going to nitpick. I think they may make some knobs available to U.S. customers. I mean, make some knobs available to European customers. That they may not allow those same knobs in the U.S. because there's value in data and being able to sell that data and do whatever they want in the data in the U.S. But I think the underlying capability will be there.
All right. In networking news, or at least internet news, Montana Governor Steve Bullock signed an executive order stating that ISPs with state contracts must abide by net neutrality principles, no throttling, no fast lanes. ISPs will have 6-month grace period to get in compliance with the new rules. It's unclear if this will violate the FCC's ban on states implementing their own net neutrality rules, although the new FCC net neutrality rules haven't been registered as far as I know quite yet, so they're not in effect as of yet. And we're not sure how this would exactly apply, given that it's limited to ISPs with state contracts, although presumably it would be regulating their behavior across the entire, universally, not just within the state of Montana. Steve, Keith, geez, I'm reading Steve Bullock here. You're not the governor of Montana, as far as I know, Keith.
No. Beautiful state, though.
From everything I hear, not as wild and wonderful as West Virginia, but not everyone can be. Does this seem like the natural response to kind of the net neutrality rollback, or at least the deregulation of ISPs? And I'm just kind of curious, do you think this will actually, besides from a legal perspective, does this appear a little heavy-handed, or is this just a way for maybe to get some cheap political points, for something that's very unpopular, like deregulating net neutrality?
I love it. I'm not normally a big regulation guy, but in general, if you think about it, one of the questions we asked about net neutrality is, if I'm an enterprise customer, and we normally just think about it from a consumer perspective, but even from an enterprise IT perspective, can there be a fast lane, slow lane based on just that 1 gig internet connection that I've bought with the intent of having it as a 1 gig VPN to AWS? If AWS and my ISP, let's say it's AT&T, Verizon, doesn't matter, get into a kerfuffle, and AT&T decides to put AWS traffic into a slow lane, do I then have to upgrade my contract to pay more money? So I like government protections in this sense, to say, okay, let's normalize the playing field. That's the part of the regulatory actions, the traditional ones. So what Montana is basically doing is saying, you know what? Keep it status quo. We have these rules in place today. ISPs really don't have to do anything special to continue to do it. And Montana is probably a small enough market that, depending on the legal fight part of it, I don't know. It's kind of low hanging fruit. Like, why not? Why not give it a go and stretch to see how much power the local state government has in using their contract scale to manage ISP activity. Now, the flip side of that is Montana so small that ISPs just say, you know what, the value of fast lanes and tiered data is so great that the few $1 million a year we get from revenue from Montana really isn't that seismic. You know what? It's an interesting use case to look at. It's truly intriguing.
Yeah, the one question I had was, I don't know how many ISPs actually serve Montana. I mean, because that's a very, very low population density, especially once you get outside of urban areas. And they may only have 1 or 2 ISPs, so that might, I not knowing the ISP situation out there, that may be the one downside of this, is that if this rule only impacts Verizon or AT&T or whatnot, that might make it easier to overturn it. Whether we actually had competition. Although if we had competition, ostensibly we would need net neutrality protections. That gets into a whole nother debate between regulation and competition. I don't want to touch on it. And finally, there was an interesting little piece on the register. Now, Keith, I don't know if you know this, they can be a little snarky at times.
A little bit.
I've noticed this from time to time. It slips through the cracks.
It's you know what? It's subtle. You have to really pay attention.
Yes, it's just it's so subtle. But they had an obituary for Moore's Law up recently with everything going on from as Intel processors are decreasing their process size, transistors are getting smaller. It's just getting harder and harder to pack more on a chip without there being all sorts of gate leakages and all sorts of limits of physics. Literally, is what we're running into with that. And so they were just kind of saying, and that on top of the Spectre meltdown performance hits we're seeing on Intel CPUs and really across a variety of computing platforms, that the age of ever denser CPUs and doubling of performance every 2 to 3 years, let's say, has kind of come to an end. One, I always take exception to Moore's Law just because it was like a thing that was postulated by Gordon Moore. I mean, he was a really smart dude. Not going to take that away from him, but it's not like it was based on like
it's not hardcore computer science. It's like
exactly,
yeah.
That's what always cracks me up about it, and the fact that he didn't even postulate that it was related to performance, only transistor count. That gets into a whole nother thing. Anyway, but I don't think we can deny the fact that now, at least for now, we've reached with x86 and traditional silicon CPUs, we've reached a little bit of we're approaching the limits of physics to how small we can make transistors, how much we can fit on a particular size die. And we are starting to see slowdowns in terms of performance gains generation to generation. Intel, has kind of moved off their TikTok development cycle. We're seeing more convoluted, their 8th generation CPU release is kind of a mess in terms of what architectures are even on there. And we're just not seeing the big gains in performance that we saw, in the 90s and the early 2000s, going all the way back to the 70s and 60s. On top of this, with performance hits from Spectre and Meltdown, they're kind of inherent to these architectures, at least for the older processors. If that's true, if we are seeing a plateau in terms of performance for x86 compute going forward, and we're not going to see huge gains, we're going to see much more gradual gains. How does this impact a data center and an enterprise that's increasingly, we're always hearing about the software-defined data center that, we have the good enough compute, and so let's, we don't need specialized hardware. Commodity's fine, but let's throw some software on it. It's going to be amazing. How does that affect it if, if, for lack of a better term, Moore's Law is dead?
Yeah, so we're going to see innovation in other areas that have frankly been ignored to an extent in the data center. So we're going to get IO is by far the biggest bottleneck in a modern data center. So as you look at photonics and just innovations, HP is talking about their machine and the ability to use parallel processing, and the controllers the controllers in IO needed to make memory-based compute a reality. I think we're going to see innovation in that area, and obviously we're going to see innovation in the presentation layer and making compute easier to consume. So I'm not lamenting the death of Moore's Law as much. Our good friend of the podcast, why am I blanking on his name? Our architecting friend, Architect IT. He is a super good friend. The British bloke. Anyway,
we'll put it in post.
We'll put it in the post. But he did a blog post on the growth of SATA SSDs in the data center and cloud scale. Just read it this morning. Excellent post talking about where the focus is, how web scalers probably won't go out and buy new hardware because there's a lot of opportunity performance gains at the IO, specifically at that storage layer, replacing 10K drives with SATA drives. Chris Evans, no, I don't know why. Forget Chris's names. Chris M. Evans on Twitter, and so we'll see innovation there. So I'm lamenting the death of Moore's Law in the sense that I used to budget a new desktop every 2 years, and I'm looking at my 5K iMac thinking, man, I would really like a new desktop, but I really don't have a reason to justify buying a new desktop this year.
Well, Keith, you always have my permission to get an iMac Pro anytime you want. Feel free. I will not be held responsible for any of the personal consequences you may suffer.
My wife is all. My wife. I floated the idea of like, this new $5,000 Mac came out, could really help me edit videos faster, and just blank stare.
as you should receive, Keith. As you should. All right. Well, that's been the Gestalt IT Rundown. We're here live Wednesdays every week at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. So make sure you tune in for that. And we put it up on gestaltit.com. That's where you can find my writing. Keith, where can people find more of your fine work?
You can find me on Twitter at CTO Advisor, which is, a good aggregate. And then the blog and podcast is thectoadvisor.com.
Excellent. And you can find me on Twitter at Mr. Anthropology, MR Anthropology. Most posts will be observations about being a father of a 6-month-old, for fair warning. But occasionally there's some good IT news there. We just shared, speaking of Skyport Systems, we just shared a podcast that we did with them. That was one of my favorites that we did for the on-premise IT Roundtable. And I'm obligated to say this because we're on YouTube. Subscribe. There's a button somewhere. Hit it. Subscribe to this channel. It's awesome. We will see you next week. Thanks so much. Take care, everybody, and have a super sparkly day.